I wasn't supposed to look inside the crate. Mr. Venter from the rail yard told me twice, and he has the kind of mustache that makes boys remember orders, like two stiff gray snakes facing off above his lip. But he also knows I'm quick, and I don't drop things, and he wanted the crate delivered before the thunder got there. So he pointed at the dark bruise of the storm rolling over Brixton Ridge and said, "Make it to the professor's house before the first drops, boy. No dawdling." The crate had a chalk number scrawled on the side and a label that said Wits University, Department of Anatomy, and a stamp from a place I had only seen in the train timetable, Tong. I didn't know then that people would say that name for 100 years. It was late November, and the jacarandas were letting go of their purple. Riding through Bramfontein was like pedaling across violet jam, the petals popping quietly under my tires. The city smelled like wet dust and coal smoke, and somewhere a woman was burning paraffin under a kettle, and that thin blue smell followed me down Simmons Street. I'd wrapped twine around the crate so it sat snug on the carrier of my bicycle. Every bump made the rope creak and the crate answer with a slow, heavy shift. Whatever was inside was stone or iron, the kind of weight that sits there and pretends it has all the time in the world. The professor's house was in Parktown, up where the air is cleaner and the garden hedges try to be England. I arrived just as the first drops big enough to leave dark coins on the pavement landed. You could hear the thunder talking to itself, saying it was going to do something, just wait. I kicked down the bicycle stand and wiped my palms on my shorts. My mother hadn't let me leave without scrubbing my knees, though the dust never really leaves your knees in Johannesburg. There were already cars parked outside the house, which meant a party, the smart kind where you could smell furniture polish if you took a deep breath. I rang the bell. A man in a collar stiff enough to slice bread opened and looked at the crate like it was a cow that had wandered into a tea shop. Behind him I saw a blur of ladies' hats and white tablecloths, and someone laughing in the way that means the joke isn't worth much but everyone is grateful for it. He asked who I wanted, and when I said the professor's name, he made his eyebrows do a small dance and said, "He is otherwise occupied, young man," in that tickly English voice that leaves a powder on your ears. I said, the rail yard said it was urgent, and I must have looked like that storm because the man frowned at the sky, then let me drag the crate down the hall. The house felt cool, with something lemony in the air, and the floorboards gave little sighs under my boots. At the end of the hall there was a room with green walls and shelves like a library, except instead of books there were bones. I had never seen so many skulls in one place. Human skulls, and bigger ones that might have been cows or wildebeest, and long thin ones with teeth like piano keys. The skulls watched us. My hand got sweaty on the rope. That's where he found me, the professor, with chalk on his sleeves and his tie loose, as if he'd wrestled the knot and only won on points. He had an Australian way of talking, which to my ears sounded like someone had put sand in English and shaken it. He came into the bone room like he was late for himself and saw my crate and stopped. His face changed, like when a cloud moves off the sun and the gold comes back to the street. "From Tong," he said, and when I nodded he laughed, a proper hoop that made the skulls look even more surprised, and then he apologized to them under his breath. He looked over his shoulder at the hallway where voices and a piano were leaking in, wiped his hands on his trousers, and crouched next to the crate. "Thank you," he said, and when he looked at me his eyes were so alive I could have sworn they were warm. "You were quick," I said, "Storm," and he grinned and reached for the hammer on his desk. The hammer was clean, like it had never done anything dirty, and the way he held it was like a violin. Outside, the thunder finally decided to say its piece. He tapped the nails out one by one without splitting the wood. It was like watching someone open a letter from the future. Inside was stone. Not one stone, but lumps, all wrapped in newspaper. The newspapers were from here and there, some English, some Afrikaans, some with adverts for liniment and boots and biscuits. He unwrapped them carefully, as if the stone might take offense if it was pulled too fast. The storm settled into proper rain, drumming on the roof like 100 children with spoons. The professor took a breath and said, very softly, "All right." And that was what broke the rules for me, because once a grown-up says something like that in the voice you use for a kitten, it's clear that rules are going to have to wait outside. He turned one of the wrapped bundles in his hands and paused. I don't know why, because the paper looked like the others. But he lowered it onto the table as if it might run away, and peeled it back as if he was about to see a wound. The thing inside wasn't a wound, and it wasn't pretty. It was a lump the color of dried bread, with a shape in it that made my heart do something odd, like a bird hitting a window and then flying anyway. Eye sockets. Not empty, but not alive either. A little face, not human but not an animal I knew, peeking out of stone. The professor exhaled, and then he was all elbows and careful hands and murmured yes, yes, yes. He said orbit and zygoma and foramen magnum, words like stones you could only move if you knew where to put your feet. I wanted to ask what those things meant, but the professor had fallen into the river of his own thoughts. He held the lump up and turned it so the light from the window, which was pewter now from the rain, slid across it and showed the smoothness of the brow, the smallness of the teeth, the place where the bone opened at the base. His face was both astonished and proud, as if he had just recognized an old friend in a crowd. A woman in a hat looked in the door and said, "Raymond, the cake," with the kind of importance that makes brave men fold. He turned, not really looking at her, his eyes still full of stone. "1 minute," he said, and she sighed and withdrew. He had a bride somewhere in the house, and a piano to please, and guests expecting him to smile on schedule. But his hands were full of time. I'll tell you something else I'm not supposed to say. In that moment, in that green room with the rain and the bones and the lemon furniture Polish smell, I felt like I belonged in a story that was bigger than my city. I was 12. My job was to bring boxes from the rail yard and make sure I didn't scuff anyone's polished floor. But the small face in that stone looked at me the way babies look at the person holding them, as if everything happens between two eyes and a mouth. I couldn't have said what it was then. I only knew I was part of it in the way that you know, even with your eyes shut, when someone is watching you and not in a bad way. We didn't know then what I can tell you now, because now I'm older, even if my voice still has the trouble finding a middle to sit in. We didn't know that the whole world would argue about that little skull and then gradually, stubbornly, turn its face toward the idea that this place, my place, carried the old human story like a song that doesn't need a proper stage. We didn't know that some fancy bones dug up in England would turn out, years later, to be a trick, glued together to make proud men prouder. But in that moment the professor knew what the stone was whispering, and I heard him listening. The professor had to go cut a cake. He put the stone down and told me to wait. He pointed at a cabinet and said, "The key is on the hook, left of the door. Lock it when I ask you." I stood guard like a sentry, with the sweet smell of icing drifting in from the hall and the rain still drumming, while the small face in the stone stared at the ceiling. When the professor came back he had crumbs on his tie and a look in his eye like he had eaten the cake only because he had to. He locked the door and brought the stone under the light, the proper light that made the shades of bone and sediment line up and show their seams. He talked as he worked. Not to me, maybe not even to himself. "It's the base," he said. Look where it is. Look there. He touched the hole underneath, his finger as gentle as a mother's. You sit upright. You do. Then he laughed again, not at a joke, but like you laugh when something makes sense and you feel the click inside your chest. That night I told my mother what I'd seen. She was stirring dinner, samp boiling with beans and a bay leaf, and her hair had escaped its pins and stuck to her temple with the steam. She listened with her eyebrow up, which meant she was interested even if she didn't want me to think she was. A baby's skull in a rock, she said, and when I nodded she said, you didn't touch it, I hope. I went near it, I said, which wasn't the same as touching. He said it was important. Men always say that about things that don't belong to them, she said, and then she smiled to show me she was only partly serious. Tell him to eat his food next time. You can't live on old bones. After that the professor's bone room was a place I went when the messages I carried happened to point me that way. He never looked surprised when I appeared at his door. Ah, he'd say, as if I were a little bit of weather he liked, and wave me in. I learned the names of the things he said without meaning to. Atlas and axis, the top two vertebrae like a pair of dancers. Occipital, temporal, parietal. Words that felt balanced in your mouth, as if they'd been smoothed by many tongues. He let me watch him work at the stone every chance he got, chipping and brushing and soaking in vinegar, always just enough, never too much. He peeled time off the face as if it were an onion that had been growing for 1,000,000 years. Men came to see the skull. Men in stiff collars and men in softer ones. Journalists with pencils and men with eyebrows like hedges. Some nodded as if they had always known what they were seeing. Some smiled politely and asked questions that made the professor's mouth go thin. It got to be a thing, whether a face in stone can be a person or a monkey, and whether a hole's position on the base tells you where the neck stood in life, and whether that meant walking the way I walked down Simmons Street, with my feet on the ground and my head too full for a four-legged thought. I didn't understand the anger on the faces of the men who didn't like what they were hearing. The skull didn't have anger. It had curiosity carved into it. The orbit rim was smooth with it. One afternoon in December the professor took the skull to the lab at WITS, to show it to the other anatomists. He let me carry one of the mineral boxes, the heavy one with the little bits that weren't the face but were just as important, he said, the end of a jaw with small teeth, a piece with an ear tube. The university is a new kind of place, with walls that don't know yet whether they want to be old. The lecture hall smelled of chalk and varnish, and the ceiling fanned the heat around without really making it go away. Boys and girls my age don't go into that sort of hall. But I had the box, and the professor waved me forward, and the doorkeeper didn't know whether to stop me and decided to do nothing, the brave choice. They put the skull on a table covered in a green cloth that smelled like camphor. People leaned in and then leaned back, like waves, faces coming forward with their mouths a little open and then rolling away with the taste of something they couldn't name yet. The professor spoke calmly, and that made it more exciting, as if the fire was going to make up its own mind without anyone having to shout. He traced a finger around the opening at the base. If this were a monkey, he said, you would find this here, pointing at the back, and not there. He pointed to the middle. This is where we put it when we are upright. Later he showed me an atlas plate, a book drawing of a skull base. He held it next to the stone like you might show a person a mirror. See, he said, and I saw, not with all the words, but with the kind of seeing that children use when they put their hands on a tree and know that roots are underneath without asking the tree to explain its degree. He tapped the page with his finger. African child, he said, very quiet, and his face went soft, like when he held his wife's hand during the church hymn, which he did so carefully I thought his fingers might be made of paper and not want to tear. After that day I started hearing more arguments. Not the loud family ones about laundry and rent and whether the chickens had any sense at all, but the kind in the newspaper and on the tram, the kind where men in hats shake their heads as if heavy ideas will fall out of their ears and make the rest of us agree. London people sent letters of the printed sort. Some said yes, yes, and used the word graceful, and some said no, no, and used the word apish. You could tell where a person came from by the words they chose for things. I learned new names, like Neanderthal, which sounded like a place where dwarfs live but is actually a valley in Germany, and Heidelberg, which is a jaw found near the river, and Cro-Magnon, which makes you think of a croquet club but isn't. Men in English magazines said that old humans were European gentlemen in rough coats who had only to comb their hair and step out to supper. They wrote as if Africa were the pantry where someone had forgotten to sweep. At the rail yard where I spent my mornings, unloading crates of everything from typewriters to chicken wire, Cabello leaned on a cargo hook and said, "So your professor thinks our grandfathers were little and hairy." He told the joke with his eyes, which were the kind that liked jokes but didn't let them win. He wore his cap sideways because a straight cap belonged to a man with no opinions. His father worked in a quarry up north before he got the job at the yard, and he had seen rocks cracked open to show bones as easy as someone cuts an orange. "They say the stone there is soft like chalk," he said, "and the bones are like someone fell asleep and forgot to wake up." "That's where the crate came from," I said. "Tong. There's a waterfall that put the stone there." I knew that because the professor had told me, tracing the drip of water with his finger on the air, showing me how slow things can be urgent. "The deposit is tufa," he had said. Travertine. Think of a kettle, how it coats itself over years of boiling. I had put my hand on our kettle after that and felt oldness in the smooth white skin it grew inside. Cabello whistled through his teeth. "My father says the men there chip away all the time without knowing where to stop. They crack a bone and only find out afterward that they did a small murder." He looked at me sideways. "You going to go see this place?" "I have to deliver whatever comes next," I said, and that was as close to a promise as I let myself make. The idea of going to the place where those bones slept made my chest tight and giddy, like standing up too fast. The professor didn't take me to Tong. That would have been like taking the family cat on safari. But in January he sent for me with a message to collect a crate at the post office and bring it straight back. "Don't let them leave it in the sun," he said. He handed me a note with his signature. "You are to be obeyed if anyone fusses." The note felt like a badge in my pocket. I delivered it at the counter with both my eyebrows in their best earnest arrangement. The man at the desk looked at the signature, made a sniffing sound like someone considering a turnip, and then rang a bell with a little too much shoulder, as if to show me that he, too, mattered. The crate smelled like damp stone, and when I lifted it a splash of water hit my shoe, as if a little pond had been kept in the dark just long enough to protest. I pedaled fast through a city that was trying to decide whether it wanted to be nice to us with a breeze or throw heat like a bully. At traffic corners, the policemen in their white helmets looked bored and brave at the same time. At the tram stop, a woman in a peach dress fanned herself with a copy of the Star. I tried to read the headlines upside down as I passed. Something about a mine strike in the Free State. Something about the cricket results. Something, on page 3 when I got hold of a copy later, about a professor's claim that made dinner tables tilt. In the afternoon, when the shadows were like long fingers pointing at the wrong things, the professor showed me the ridge of bone above the eyes, how it was smaller than in the monkeys he had in the cabinet. Gibbon, he said, pulling a skull out by its card. It had an underbite like a small gangster. He set it next to the face in stone without fear of shaming either. He did that a lot, arranged faces into conversations. You could hear them if you listened, stone and bone and chalk drawings, all talking under their breath about who stands on what and why. I asked him, where did we begin? It was bold, but the question had rattled in me all day, like marbles in a tin. He kept working as he answered, testing the stone with a metal pick that rang like a surprised bell when it missed. I think we began in places like Tong, he said. Places where the ground remembers, where water and time have more patience than we do. He didn't say Europe. He didn't say Asia, where another man had found a skull in Java and people were busy deciding whether that story counted. He said the name of the place that sent us this small face, and his hand on the pick was steady. On Sundays, when my mother let me be lazy if I promised to go to church later, I walked to the Indian market in Fordsburg with Cabello. The spice stalls smelled like someone's warm pocket, cardamom and cinnamon and something sharp that made your eyes run a little but felt good. Sellers said things in words I didn't know and then smiled at our confusion. We bought a cone of chana and ate it with our fingers, the salt on our tongues making the heat friendlier. An old man in a white cap sat on a wooden crate and watched us with a stillness that felt like a kind of power. He overheard me telling Cabello about foramen magnum. He nodded, like my words were birds he recognized. When I said upright, he said, you stand because you must carry, and your hands must be free. He lifted his to show me, pale palms, creased like maps. The arguments in the papers grew louder, but they were always polite. Polite can be a way of hiding a knife without anyone noticing. Men in London used phrases like with all respect and then said things that made the professor's jaw work. One headline asked if man began in Europe, as if continents are cousins in a race and some of them cheat. Another said that English bones had been found that told a better story. I didn't know then that those bones were lying in more ways than one. I only knew that the professor did not sleep much, and his wife put her hand on his shoulder sometimes like she was checking the temperature of a kettle. One afternoon, in the heat that made the lab windows look like the sky was holding its breath, I came into the skeleton room to find an older man with eyes the color of old bottles, greenish and hard. He was a visiting doctor, the sort that wears his certainty like a waistcoat. He lifted the little face in stone he had asked, and the professor had nodded because hospitality is a lot older than arguments and turned it as if it were a fruit he wasn't sure when to bite. Charming, he said. But it is sorry to say just a young ape. It is a young person, the professor said, and the softness in his tone was the kind that comes from a backbone, not a bending. The older man raised a brow. A person. Look here, the professor said, pointing to the base, to the hole that had become our secret plan, and here, to the small canine tooth that was honest in its modesty, and here, to the brow that didn't wish to bully. He spoke quietly, like a whisper can be more true than a trumpet. The older man listened because he had to, and nodded without agreement. When the older man had left, the professor held the stone differently for a moment, perhaps to reassure himself that it had not changed under someone else's gaze. He looked at me and smiled. We will send a report to nature, he said, as if sending a note to a neighbor's kitchen with a loaf of bread. They have to listen. At home my mother asked, why do you care what men in London think? Do their bones weigh more than mine? She was not cross. Her eyes were bright, and she was a person whose bright eyes made others sit up. The earth where you were born knows your shape, Thomas. I told her I wanted to see Tong. She pursed her lips and said, "Do you think it is going to run away?" But I saw the small smile she couldn't keep furry. She gave me a tin of coexisters to bring the professor's wife when I said the professor was leaving to look at the place where the bone had come from. "Travel without sugar is bad luck," my mother said, tying a towel around the tin. "Give her this for her patience." The professor left in July, when the air cracks like new linen and your breath in the morning feels like someone else's. He went by train and then by motorcar, and then on foot, because roads are less sure in the country, and besides, once you are close to something important, the best thing to do is walk. He sent a postcard of a waterfall drawn badly by someone who had not really looked at the water. The words on the back said, "The quarrymen are generous with their time. The tufa is a cathedral." He came back with his clothes full of stone dust and his eyes even more awake, which I didn't think possible. He had seen the place, and because he had, I felt closer to it too, as if the dust clinging to his coat collar had stories in it that would blow off into the room and settle on my skin. Later, when people wrote about his trip, they said there was not much left at the spot where the skull had been found. The quarrymen had done what quarrymen do. They break rock to make houses and roads and pay for food. They aren't meant to be careful in the way professors are. But the professor didn't hold them to a promise they hadn't made. He asked them to be his eyes anyway and to send anything odd, any stone with a look in it. He promised to pay. He knew the world turns because many people do the small tasks that count more than the big ones we write about later. I never got to Tong that year. But I went there in my head so often that I could feel the way the sun would taste on my tongue, tinny and pure. I could smell lime dust and donkey sweat, and hear the bang of a blasting charge, not vicious but firm, and the slow grind of cartwheels. At night I lay on our back steps in Jepistone and felt winter stars pin me to the ground like a moth to a card, and I thought about that little skull, and how its owner might have looked up at the same kind of sky, busy with pinpricks and the faint road of the Milky Way. I pressed my thumb into my palm until it left a circle, reminding myself that soft can remember hard if you hold it long enough. When the paper came the day the professor's article appeared, we bought two, one to read and one to keep. My mother tucked the clean copy into the linen cupboard, the safest place she knew. The article was not in a language that everyone could read, but the parts that mattered were clear even to a boy who had learned his big words by delivering things. The professor called the skull Australopithecus africanus, which rolled in my mouth like a song and a sneeze. Southern ape of Africa. The letters looked like marching ants all in a line, but the meaning felt like water. The professor said the skull was a young one, not a baby, perhaps the age of a child who would help carry wood from the yard. He said the opening for the spine was under the head and not behind, and that meant walking the way we do. He said the teeth were not huge, and that meant something about diet and manners, which is to say power and what you need it for. People argued. Of course they did. Arguments are a kind of breathing. Some wrote to say that no ape could be so like a person. Others wrote to say that no person could be so like an ape. Men threw around the distances of ages as if they were coins. Millions of years were like boar sweets piled on the table, bright and not to be eaten all at once. I couldn't get my head around that part. Time that big is like the sea. You can't drink it. You can only let your feet be wet and say that it's there. I made my own observations, which is a fancy way of saying I paid more attention. I watched people walking in the street, how they balanced, how the point of them seemed to be a forward thing. I stood in the mirror and put my fingers behind my head where the skull meets the neck and felt the place where the cord goes in. I stuck my tongue between my teeth and noticed how my front teeth bite up against the lower ones in a neat fit, like a lid on a tin, not like a dog's where the bottom jaw sticks out. I watched the monkeys at the zoo and saw that they were impressive and distracting, all at once, their shoulders a kind of loudness. When I said these things to the professor, he said, "Yes, exactly. You have good eyes." And then he made me repeat the word occipital until I could say it without tripping over my own tongue. I didn't tell him everything I thought. I didn't tell him about the night I dreamed that the little skull woke up and smiled at me with baby teeth, and how I woke with that smile in my throat like a hiccup. Or about how I held my mother's hand at church and tried to imagine the bones under the skin, not to be morbid, but to feel the way everything inside us is shaped by a story that goes farther back than the front door of the church. Our pastor said we came from dust and to dust we would return, and for once that didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a promise that there is a home you can't lose because you are made of it. One evening, a year or two later, I was at the rail yard when a man with a brown suitcase and a halo of dusty hair came to ask for directions to the university. He had an accent that belonged to somewhere north of here and south of the equator. He said he had just been to caves west of town where the stone is full of secrets and the air smells like old rain. He spoke with a hunger that made me think of the professor. Years after that, he would find more bones in the caves, different ones, cousins perhaps. I mention him because the story doesn't end where you think it might. It keeps walking. You want me to tell you whether human beings began here or in Europe, as if I have the authority to stamp a continent with an official seal. I don't. But I can tell you that when the wind blows in from the Highveld in winter, crisp and smelling faintly of dust and something warm burned long ago, it carries a feeling with it that is very like a memory you didn't make yourself. I can tell you that bones have a way of lying quiet until the right eyes come along, and then they tell the same truth they always held, in whatever word suits the ear that hears it. I can tell you that men once held up the skull of a fake person in a Sussex field and said, here is the beginning," and later, when the glue was found, their cheeks burned not from the sun but from something else. And across the sea, here, a child's face in a cathedral of tufa kept telling its story without hurrying, without boasting, just being what it was. The professor retired, eventually. Even men made of chalk and verbs have to sit down. He lived long enough to see people change their minds, and he did not wave his arms and shout, "I told you so," though a part of me wanted him to. He held young bones in his old hands and his smile was as soft as ever. I grew taller, and my bicycle looked small under me like a dog that has somehow shrunk. I took a job that kept me close to the rail yard's muscle, and I read the papers with the habit of a person who feels he has a stake in what men argue about. I married and had a son whose head I kissed with more reverence than I might have had otherwise. If you stand behind a person you love and put your hand on the back of their neck, feeling the little warm knob where the spine meets the skull, you will want to be good to them, not because God will scold you if you are not, but because your hand tells you a truth stronger than scolding. Every now and then I go and stand at the university gates and look through at the students swarming like ants in bright shirts, and I think about how once I walked there with a heavy box of stone and felt like the universe had tapped me on the shoulder in a kind way. The campus has grown, like a boy who has been eating enough pap and now needs new shoes. The skull is not always on display. It's too precious and too vulnerable. But sometimes it comes out into the light in a case of glass, and people whisper around it. I have seen schoolgirls with braids and boys with hair like hedgehogs stand with their hands on the glass as if they are warming themselves at a fire. I have stood a little way off and watched their faces, the way their mouths do a little open thing and then close on whatever they are thinking. You can tell when someone's mind is making room. Once, a few years ago, a man from England gave a talk in the hall. He was kind and smart and careful with his history. He said that the story of where we began was once told like a parade that starts in cave paintings and heads straight to oil paintings, with orchestras tuning as it walks, and everyone keeps time nicely. He said that now the story is more like a river system, with lots of tributaries joining from unlikely places. He said that the oldest channels we have found so far start here and in places nearby on the continent, and that they sing in languages we are still learning to hear properly. He said Europe is full of wonders, and that this does not make Africa less wonderful. He said that the river is us. When the talk was over, and people rustled their paper programs and coughed the way polite people cough, I went to stand under the jacaranda that leans over the path by the library. It was October again, and the flowers were doing their slow snow, and the carpet under my boots was purple like a bruise. The air smelled exactly right. I thought of the day long ago when I brought the crate in the rain, and how the professor's hands shook just a little with a kind of stillness. I thought of the old man in the white cap who told me about hands and carrying. I thought of Caballot's sideways cap and his father's quarry stories. I thought of my mother's coexisters and how sugar is weatherproof for the soul. I thought of the little face in the stone and the way it looked like it had been surprised into life and then surprised out of it again. I can't tell you what every bone means. But I can tell you that the first time you hold your child and feel the soft plate at the top of their head, the little place where the skull will knit itself into a harder story, you understand in the cleanest way that you are made of things that came before you but are not finished yet. The world is like that. Its stories have old bones inside them and new skin on top. And when someone says the word origin, I think of a room painted green and the smell of lemon and chalk, and I think of a small hole under a skull, in exactly the place it needs to be for walking upright into the afternoon. I think of a hill baked brown, and a lip of white limestone holding a waterfall some time before any person wrote it down. I think of water patient enough to make a cathedral and then leave. I think of a boy pedaling fast enough to outrun a storm, and how sometimes, with the luck of being alive, you arrive at the door just as the first drops fall, and someone lets you in.